Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Ashvin Vaidyanathan, Chief Customer Officer at Gainsight. If you're unfamiliar with Gainsight, they are the customer success company. So what better to talk about partnering with customer success than talking with the Chief Customer Officer at Gainsight? I'm really excited for today's episode with Ashvin because his viewpoint on customer success and pre-sales partnership is incredible. He actually tells us early on that he is part of the pre-sales process. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about what Ashvin believes are the keys to successful partnership between customer success and pre-sales. I think this is a friction point for so many organizations. And so we're going to talk about what's working, what's not working, what are the keys to success. So I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Ashvin, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How are you, sir?
I am doing well. Thank you for having me. It's excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have you. I mean, you actually are the first non-pre-sales guest on the PreSales Podcast. So we're really happy to have you. This is a big moment for us.
Wow, I'm humbled. And I consider myself to always be selling. So I'm part of pre-sales, regardless of whether my title says that or not.
That's fantastic. There it is right there. We're starting off on the right foot for sure. How have things been going for you? I mean, I know that you manage a large team and obviously the pandemic has challenged all of us, but how has that been for you and your team and your organization?
I mean, I think it's similar to other companies and other leaders. It's good and bad. Good in that like we're pretty distributed already as a company. And so we didn't have to adjust too much to working remotely. Like it was almost people were already there. But like for a company that does customer success, we like talking to customers a lot, being with them a lot. So there was some adjustment to be made on that front. And like our teammates who have now kids and dependents at home working through all of that, there's obviously a lot of pressure, both physical, mental, working through all of this. So yeah, good and bad, but business has been fine. Like we're counter-cyclical in that way. Obviously, like when new business slows down, churn and retention become that much more important. So generally CS as a profession got a lot of limelight during this whole pandemic because every CS leader had more things to do. So it's been good on that front.
That's great to hear. And I appreciate that insight. A question for you that I have a little bit of curiosity around, because you are a customer success organization and are used to spending so much time and energy with these customers. What has been the change for your customers, right? If they're used to having you in person, face to face, how has that changed for them? And how have you guys kind of rotated to that?
One thing we always enjoy in selling to customer success leaders is we get a lot of empathy, right? Because if you think about it, they're experiencing the same with their customers. So they kind of reciprocate that with us in working with their customer success peers. So like part of this is, yes, they do miss moving faster and doing like just do a week-long on-site and let's just hash through everything. That can't happen anymore. And so there is some productivity and efficiency that's lost as part of this transaction, but they're also spending more time at home with their family and they're happier for the same, right? So there is some give and take that happens. We're lucky to have a really strong marketing and events organization. So we do a lot of webinars, a lot of virtual events, happy hours and things like that to just keep some childlike joy going in that sense. So yeah, that's how we're trying to make it happen.
I love that. And thanks for sharing that perspective for sure. So before we get into today's subject, which is partnering with customer success, I want to ask you how you got into customer success. And, I was actually looking at your LinkedIn prior and saw you were an engagement manager. But even when you first started the podcast, you said, hey, you're in sales, you're in pre-sales already. So you already have that connection to the profession, which I love. Maybe tell us your story about how you got into customer success.
Let me start by saying, like, I've been very lucky in my career. I've had the opportunity to work in a variety of different industries and roles. So I started off in sales roles in publishing, in IT, then did some product marketing and pricing in semiconductors, did some marketing, branding, and channel strategy at McKinsey when I was doing some consulting work and strategy consulting there. But the common thread across generally my entire career has been I enjoy working with clients and in general customers and clients, and I enjoy solving hard, complex problems. So those two things have always been true across the board. And so when I heard of this blooming profession called customer success with lots of customers, lots of different types of problems, some complex, some not so complex. It just made like a logical extension to my career. Like the way we were thinking about it, or I was thinking about it when I started at Gainsight, was kind of like what marketing automation was maybe 10, 20 years back, in terms of like just starting off, getting more rigor, like community was getting together to solve important problems. CS feels like that over the last 5 or 6 years. And so it's almost like I didn't make it to the marketing ship, but I want to make it to this ship and see how it rises with the waves. So that's what prompted me to get into this profession.
Well, I feel like being in customer success at a company focused on customer success, like you guys are at the forefront, at the center, at the pinnacle. So that's amazing. And, you've been there for almost 6 years. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. It's going to be 6 in February.
Congratulations. It's really interesting because the market, like you're saying, how it's changed and what your role for that is, it is quite interesting for sure. And as sales continues to change and buying continues to change, what customer success actually means has shifted. So I want to talk about that for sure, because I want to talk about how that works with pre-sales. So let's maybe, as we get into the subject of partnering with customer success, maybe talk to us at a high level. What is your customer success philosophy?
At the most simplistic level, I think of customer success as the fastest and the most effective way for any software provider or any company to unlock value and ROI for your customers, which obviously, like, what's in it for you as a company is it unlocks growth for your company, right? So it's CSIC is the fastest and the most effective way to do it. The need for CS, however, like changes as your company grows. If you're a really small company just starting off, the big need is product market fit. And so the goal for customer success in your org is to make sure that that loop of voice of the customer back to the R&D team is as efficient and as synthesized as possible. And so that's the role that they play. If you become a much bigger organization, the need for customer success is how can I efficiently ensure renewals and maybe like upsells while delivering the best possible customer experience. I don't have to go to 5 different people to solve that problem. I just go to that one person and that's efficient. So the what people do in companies changes, but it's all towards unlocking ROI for your customers and growth for your companies.
That's a great definition. Very succinct as well. It actually makes me want to ask around when or how do companies know that they need to pivot and change their CS strategies, right? Because I think it does play into like what our role is in pre-sales. So what are your thoughts there?
Again, like it typically aligns pretty well if you're a venture-backed company, especially. It aligns well typically with the way you raise rounds as well, like Series A or B or seed or Series A especially. Like you're still finding some product market fit, identifying what your ideal customer profile might look like and all of that good stuff, in which case the role of CS is very different. They're product experts. Then you move into like maybe B or C or D and you're trying to scale things up. Your business is growing pretty well at this point, but you're not hiring a new CSM every month. You're trying to see how you can improve ratios and efficiency and productivity. And so the role of CS changes at that point in time. And then you can either equate it to when you raise money, or you can equate it to maybe when you hit certain revenue milestones too. Like for the first 5 million, there is a completely different persona of CS out of the CS. The next 5 to 50 looks very different. Once you cross 100 million in revenues, like it looks very different. And then a billion looks very, very different. So I think some of that is what you're trying to do and like how your growth pattern looks like. That decides what CS does.
I appreciate you breaking that down for us. As we talk about that kind of journey, to you, like why is pre-sales important to you generally and how you execute on your customer success philosophy?
I work very closely with Brent Kremkes at Gainsight, who is my pre-sales peer, and a really important relationship because there's a common belief that there are some quotes, etc., along this, which says that the seeds of a successful customer or churn are laid during onboarding, basically like as you go through the initial stages after you become a customer. But I would argue that it actually gets influenced in the pre-sales process because the expectations that you set of the prospective customer for what they can get in the first month, first 6 months, or first year basically defines what they come in expecting and what your post-sales onboarding and CS teams have to deliver to it, right? So if there is dissonance between what they expect and what they get, That generally is the reason why companies churn. And hence, like all of those need to be addressed in the pre-sales cycle. The other way that I think about this is pre-sales spends a bunch of time, especially in more complex products. They spend a lot of time in the pre-sales process with the customer. They build relationships, they understand their business significantly well. How well do you capture the outcomes that the customer wants? How well do you baseline it and talk about like the actual value engineering of where the customer wants to go? And how do you actually translate that and make sure that the knowledge is transferred to the customer success organization becomes super critical as you think about that process. This is why like there's so many things that happen in the pre-sales process that are important that those teams work really closely with customer success organizations.
You hit a hot button with me. You said the word expectations. I used to have my LinkedIn title. My role was managing expectations because it is really interesting, right? Because I made this comment before. Sometimes in onboarding and post-sale, sales will sell the dream and then you have to onboard the nightmare. And, you talk about the expectations and that is a really key factor, right? So sometimes you have sales organizations that traditionally have sold a little bit of snake oil to get a deal across and they don't have any accountability on the post-sale side, right? So it's like, okay, post-sale, you guys handle this. And I've seen that in some organizations. I've seen that really backfire in organizations as well. So I love that you talked about expectations there.
And even on that one, like I appreciate the balance that sales and like SCs have to go through, because if you're too aggressive, then you are setting up the customer for a churn, you're setting up the rest of the company product and CS for failure, basically, right? Because it's really hard to live up to that vision very quickly. If you're too conservative, then the customer doesn't buy into the vision and the initial land deal is much smaller because the perception of value is much smaller. So I totally empathize and appreciate with the fine dance that sales teams have to do to get there. I think the best salespeople I've worked with and SCs I've worked with typically tend to sell the vision, but they'll also be the ones who bring in realism in saying you won't get that vision on day one. Here is a rough roadmap for what you should expect to get there. In your case, it might take 18 months. In other companies, it might take 6 months, whatever. This is what you should expect. That is incredibly helpful. It's less about the time and whether we actually deliver in 6 months or 18 months. It's more important that the customer expects the crawl, walk, run type approach and not everything big bang on day one.
Ashvin, you're saying all the right words. I swear we didn't practice this, but I was going to say it is a dance in the pre-sales too. And like you said, I love that you said that the best SEs set the vision, but bring realism to the situation, right? Because I think customers are willing to grow with you, but you have to set that expectation because life's about expectations. I've talked about this before in the podcast. If somebody set the expectations for a restaurant and set the expectations super high and you went and you had a bad experience, you know what that's like. And that is almost like in sales. I love that you talked about that. I think that is to me one of my favorite takeaways here. But one of the things you also talked about was capturing desired outcomes for customers. And I feel like I hear a lot of companies that this is a black box, right? Post-sale and customer success complains that pre-sales does capture this, but it doesn't get passed over. So like, what do you guys do to ensure that that happens?
There are two pieces to this. One is like the hard outcomes that the customers want from getting into the relationship with any vendor, right? Step one is most companies don't have those list of outcomes agreed upon throughout the company. Meaning like what sales is selling may not be what gets implemented in the post-sales process. And a big reason for that is because the outcomes list is not agreed to across the board. So what we've done, and it's taken us like 3 or 4 different iterations to get it right, but we've now landed on 6 outcomes, which is a manageable set of lists. And on those 6 outcomes, like that's how we want SCs to demo the product. We want onboarding to deliver on the statements of work. And I want my CSMs and support organization to continuously move on delivering towards more outcomes along those 6 outcomes. So step 1, which is the hardest part, by the way, it's not the system to solve it, but agreeing on what the 6 things are that make the most sense for your customers. I think that is one. And then the other piece that I think we need to do a much better job as a pre-sales and post-sales community is in the knowledge transfer that happens when a prospective becomes a customer, it's not just these outcomes, but everything from what is their tech stack to who are the key personas, what are their quirks? Like, do they like to use certain collaboration tools, or they don't like to use Excel and they like to use Google Docs? It's simple things like that, which make a huge experience difference throughout the process. And so making sure those are captured in a meaningful way and transferred over to the other team is super important.
So one thing I tried in my past is creating what we called the solution definition document, right? And we tried to hold pre-sales accountable for filling out a little bit of this form with what you're saying and make sure that went over to post-sale, right? And that was transitioned. I feel like it's a lot harder to do in reality. And the question of like, do you do it in CRM? Do you do it in Google Docs? Like, how do you actually manage that? It's something that needs to get figured out and passed out, because I agree with everything that you're saying in terms of expectations on how it gets to post-sale for sure.
Absolutely.
One of the things I do want to talk to you about, I understand that for some of your strategic accounts, you guys use a pod model. Can you maybe explain what this pod model is, why you do it, and how it's impactful for pre-sales within these strategic engagements?
In general, in most subscription companies and subscription products, the notion of pre-sales and post-sales is already quite blurry because you're always in the land and expand type motion. And so pre-sales never really ends. You just go from landing to expanding, but it's always a sales process. We've segmented a particular set of customers or segment where it's all about expectations of growth, either organic growth or inorganic growth with them, meaning like upsells or cross-sells. But we've segmented a particular set of group of customers where the general idea is the expansion probability with them is pretty high. So in that segment, that line of pre-sales and post-sales is even more blurrier because there is always some sale happening and it's a continuous selling motion. And so in that model, the pods that we've set up basically is we've got one executive sponsor. It can be like the RVP of sales or me or the CEO in some situations. It's someone senior who has a vested interest in making that expansion happen and is almost like the relationship with the decision maker at the customer. Then you've got like an AE, an account executive or the sales lead, whose primary job is like that person is driving the car basically on that customer. They're the ones who are saying, to get us X million today that they're paying us to Y million, here is the path, here is the white space, here is what I need from the CSM organization, here is what I need from the professional services organization or product organization, etc. And then everyone else is working towards solving that account plan or that success plan for that particular customer. And so the other people in the pod would be the CSM, we would have the sales engineer or the solutions consultant. If we sold some form of services, then the architect or the technical account manager who works with those customers. Like, I think a big difference is we also added a product manager liaison to those customers. And so these are PMs who are actually working with those customers on like reacting very quickly to unlock expansion. And the idea is all of these work on a small set of customers with the notion that they get to work together on so many deals that they just start knowing each other really well. And we grease the wheels on the human element of working together.
I like that a lot. And I appreciate you breaking that down for me. What have you guys seen work really well in this? Is there a specific scenario or something where this has worked out really well in X number of cases, or because of Y?
I think the two areas where this has worked out really well is one, the CSM AE relationship has worked better than I've ever seen it work before, because now it's towards a common cause. One thing to call out is for all of these people who are in a pod, we associated a percentage of their variable comp that's tied directly to the net retention or the expansion within those customers. So now the CSM or the technical account manager, even though they may not have a quota, percentage of their bonus is tied to unlocking expansion. So now they have an incentive structure set up that enables the same thing that the AE wants to do as well. And so that has worked out really well. And then the second piece that's worked out really well is having that product manager liaison. We just react so much quicker in those situations than we would have otherwise.
That's great. And I was going to actually ask you about the compensation model there. So I'm glad you covered that. And I like the idea of the product manager liaison, because I think a lot of times I have seen that pre-sales individual solutions consultants will get pulled into some of these red accounts, and they're the ones who have to liaison with product, and they're not being comped on it. And so it can be difficult for sure.
Exactly.
So one of the things that I have heard a lot of people have questions on or differing opinions is the idea around QBRs. And how should solutions engineers, solutions consultants partner with their customer success team for QBRs?
I mean, in general, I think of my CSMs within my organization as being able to play the role of an SC for the standard use cases. So if we have to do a demo of generically what Gainsight does at most companies, my CSM should be able to do that. I don't need an SC involved. We typically bring in an SC into this relationship. Like in the pod structure, they're involved throughout the process. But if you're not a strategic or a growth customer segment, then we bring in an SC in one of two scenarios. One is there is like a brand new buyer or sponsor because they do change and decision makers change. And it's almost like a resell process at that point, right? Like where you have to convince them why they need a solution like Gainsight all over again. We can do it in the CS world, but I think SCs are just so much better at convincing and persuading in that sense. Like it just doesn't make sense to bring in someone new. So SCs make sense in that. And then the second one is if there is an expansion opportunity at that particular customer, then totally makes sense for an SC to be involved because it directly lines up with their incentive structure.
That is really interesting. And I like that because I was going to ask you another question, which I think you've already covered around what's the difference between an SC versus a CSM within your organization? Because I think a lot of times some organizations have very blurry lines, especially teams that have very technical customer success individuals. So it sounds like you've covered that, which I appreciate.
The only additional point I would make is even in companies where CSMs are very technical, they're equivalent to SCs on the hard skills of product knowledge. But SCs bring the soft skill of the people and the relationship part and how to message certain things. They're generally perceptive to reading the room much better and all of that good stuff, which it takes much longer for technical CSMs to pick up on. I think even in those places, SCs have like a very differentiated skill set.
Thanks for clarifying that. I like that a lot. One of the things that I think a lot of organizations face is friction. Friction between pre-sales, post-sale generally. What frictions have you experienced with your solutions consulting organization, and how did you get through those?
I wish I could tell you that we have no friction at Gainsight, but that would be a lie. Yeah, the typical ones that we've seen is one, they're capturing the granularity of outcomes in the pre-sales process. For example, I'll give you a very specific thing, right? We say part of the reason you buy a solution like Gainsight is because it improves the efficiency for your CSMs. And so if they were managing 10 accounts each, because of Gainsight, they can potentially manage 12 accounts each or 15 accounts. And so you don't have to keep hiring more CSMs the same way that you would have had to without an efficiency or productivity tool like Gainsight. Firstly, SCs could capture that as the outcome. But what would make even more sense is capturing the next level of detail to say, where do your CSMs, where do your users spend their time? What data do you have access, visibility to? How can the onboarding team come in and unlock value for you very quickly, etc.? Like that is the next order of granularity of details, which don't get captured to that level. And we have to go and identify that from scratch all over again, which becomes a waste of time for a lot of people. So that I think is one. The second, I think, is when there is a resale scenario that I described earlier, where there's a new sponsor or buyer at a customer, the SCs don't have the incentive to come in and help in those situations because they don't make additional commission because this is a run rate business. And so there is some misalignment of incentives. So the natural tendency is to not be part of that. Like we've gotten over that with a few things. That definitely is part of a friction point. And then the setting expectations that we spoke about pretty well in the past, like that one is obviously like SCs, they want to paint the technical vision for what is possible in the product and Gainsight. And so like also stepping back and saying, you don't get all this on day one. And maybe you don't even need all of this. That I think is a third part of that friction.
I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing that for sure. Ashvin, this has been a fantastic conversation. Your insight is incredible. Is there anything that I'm not asking you about when it comes to solutions consulting and customer success partnership?
I'll call out a trend that I'm generally seeing right now in like a few companies that do this already is like Splunk and others, where the chief customer officer also manages the SC organization. So instead of the SC organization reporting into the sales structure or the CRO in companies, it's still like a very small minority, but I'm seeing SCs rolling into the CS, being peers to CS. I can see a ton of value in that process because then the thought leadership and the tight connection between what you sell and what you implement is the exact same thing. So I'm generally seeing that, and I love the energy around that momentum.
I love that you brought that up because I'm seeing that trend as well. And I'm hearing that trend as well. I've heard a number of people talk about it, and I have a belief that it's the right way because as much as I love being in sales, being under the same roof or the same house does change the expectation. It changes the comp structure and it changes the way you approach sales. And with PreSales Collective, we continue to talk about how pre-sales can get a seat at the table. And we say seat at the executive table. And to me, either the CRO or the CCO, there's a pre-sales path upwards to CCO, more so than there probably is to a CRO, at least from what I see.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yep. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think it makes total sense.
We're ended on that. Ashvin, I really appreciate your time. I do have to ask you 2 questions before we go. A little bit different take than how I usually close, but what's your favorite thing about working with pre-sales people generally?
One is obviously knowledge of the product. And 2, I love how self-driven and motivated SCs generally are. They just manage their schedules and manage their deliverables so much better than most other organizations. So that's my favorite.
That's a great compliment. Thanks for the compliment to the industry generally. What advice do you have for people that are struggling to partner with their customer success organization?
I'll give you very tactical things. One is invite your SC leaders or even your sales leaders occasionally to your staff meetings, as if you're the head of CS or head of professional services or whatever. Like, invite SC leaders to join your sessions so that they empathize with the types of problems that you're trying to solve. They also bring in some fresh thinking about how these complex problems can be solved, right? Otherwise, you're basically trying to solve it within your own silo. Let's try to break the silo and collaborate much better. And inviting people to each other's staff meetings is one way to do it. And then the other one is, in most organizations, CSM and AEs don't collaborate well with each other. Once they solve that problem, SCs are still kept out of the loop in that context. I think SCs have so much to contribute in that context. So it can be a nice trifecta if done right between SCs, AEs, and CSMs. So I would like to see that change for sure. So that would be my second advice.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you joining and giving your perspective. This has been fantastic. So again, thank you. Best of luck the rest of the year, and we'll keep in touch, okay?
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Of course. All right, PreSales Collective. I don't know about you, but as always, I got a nice page full of notes. That was a tremendous discussion with Ashvin. As I mentioned in the beginning, I really love that he talks about his role as being pre-sales and how important it is for him to be partnering with the pre-sales team, the pre-sales process, and making sure it matches customer expectations. One thing that he said to me was the best pre-sales consultants know how to set the vision and bring realism to their deals. Understanding that there's a crawl, walk, run approach to implementation of software and how pre-sales professionals can bridge that gap. It's also great that he talks about managing the outcomes and having the pre-sales teams capture those outcomes and transfer them to the post-sale process. What I really loved is how he talked about the trend of chief customer officer owning a pre-sales team. Whether you agree with it or not, it seems to be a path that may make sense for our profession. And I did like that he hasn't heard that maybe pre-sales people could be chief customer officers. So again, those are the conversations we need to be having for our industry. So Ashvin talked a lot about unlocking value and unlocking value quickly, doing things through a pod model, but it is very clear that our account executives, customer success managers, and pre-sales consultants need to be working together for the betterment of the customer. Not only will it help you get the sell, but it helps you get the expansion, it helps you get the renewal, and keeping those customers happy over the long run. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This is only the start of the conversations with customer success. I would like to continue to have these conversations, understand what organizations are doing well, and how we can continue to improve. As always, thank you for your time. Please like, share our podcast. Otherwise, I will see you next week.